For Mac computers with Apple Silicon, let's talk about the startup, or boot options, and the changes you'll see from earlier models. Remember the startup chime? Good news! That reassuring audio cue is on Mac computers with Apple Silicon. It's on by default, but users can turn it off in System Preferences. So while you're troubleshooting, just remember that the Mac may be starting up, even if you don't hear a startup chime. The transition to Mac computers with Apple Silicon has enabled macOS to support some of the best features of iOS. The added security not only helps the user save time, but it also improves the technician's efficiency during startup and troubleshooting. Pressing the power button is the most reliable way to start up. Under normal conditions, startup also happens when you plug in the attached power adapter to a live power source. And, as long as there is sufficient battery charge, unplugged notebooks start up when the lid is raised. Notebooks will also start up by pressing the spacebar, any key, or even tapping the trackpad once. Because Mac computers with Apple Silicon have a new secure startup architecture, startup happens only after Apple verification of the secure chain of trust. Here's a look at the choices you have at startup. We'll use this diagram as a roadmap as we discuss startup options. Let's look closer. On Intel-based Mac computers, you use startup key combinations to reset SMC, PRAM, or NVRAM. Now, on Mac computers with Apple Silicon, those startup options are built into the flow and happen automatically with every startup. You can start up two ways: startup to the normal Mac OS or startup options. To launch startup options, press and hold the power button. Keep holding it up to 10 seconds and let go when you see loading startup options. It's worth mentioning here that even if you have no internal display, hold the power button for a full 10 seconds or until your external display responds. Your external display only shows video when in startup options. You can enter diagnostic mode from startup options by pressing and holding Command-D until the computer restarts. Check out SV461 for the post-repair procedures and more information about running diagnostics. All other recovery and diagnostics workflows begin from startup options. That includes starting up in different versions of macOS that may be loaded on the device, macOS Recovery, Diagnostics, and Safe Boot. Once you're in startup options, you can initiate a safe mode startup by clicking any macOS volume to select it, pressing and holding Shift, then clicking Continue in safe mode when that button appears below the selected volume. If the user's computer has more than one macOS volume, you'll notice more than one hard drive icon. Like Intel-based Mac computers with Apple Silicon allow you to install different macOS versions on the same Mac. This ensures you can accommodate your user's specific macOS version preferences. Moving on, the Options button is used to access macOS Recovery. Let's click it. A user password is required if the user has File Vault on by default and/or the activation lock is enabled. This brings us to the macOS Recovery section of the roadmap. This familiar menu appears with options for restoring from backup, reinstalling macOS, browsing Apple support, or running Disk Utility. You can also select Share Disk from the Utilities menu. It looks like this. In Share Disk, you can share a volume with another Mac using a USB or Thunderbolt cable. This replaces any other sharing option you've used before. You can read more about it in HT 211920. And finally, you can access Startup Disk from the Apple menu to select the preferred disk to start up your user's Mac. Startup Disk also gives you the ability to select security modes. You would click Security Policy to manage that. So that's a look at the startup process and features.